Last week, I went on a trip to destroy my bike. Yep, that's basically what happened. Over a 6-day trip, we endured hundreds of river and creek crossings, countless miles of slop, and yes, even death mud. So does riding your bike through conditions like that ruin your bike and your bike components? Well, in this video, we're going to take a look at my Salsa Timberjack, take a look at the components on the bike, as well as talk about some red flags that I noticed while biking on the trip, in hopes that we can find an answer to that question. Let's do it. Wonderful, so let's just jump right into the components, starting with the brakes. So these are just regular Guide R brakes. I've had them for a while, and I did bleed them just before this trip, and they held up great. But what didn't hold up well was the brake pads. And we noticed this on day 2. Basically, all of our bikes, all of our pads were destroyed because we went through death mud. What happens out there is when you go through mud, grit, and grime, even if you're not braking, you are wearing down those brake pads. So when you go through death mud that just sticks to everything, it's sticking to your pads and sticking to your rotors, that is actually wearing out those brake pads. So there's basically 2 types of brake pads that we have in the world. We have a resin or an organic compound and a metallic or a metal compound. We don't really need to get into the details of them, but for the most part, they're 2 very different types of brake pads that work pretty differently as well. Resin and organic, they are a quieter brake pad. They have a really good stopping power initially, but the problem there is they break down very quickly. And then metal or metallic brake pads, those brake pads have a different compound that actually really like to heat up a little bit. So when you do heat them up, they have a little bit more stopping power, but it takes a little bit more time to heat up the brake and the rotor. But in turn, that compound is a lot more durable. So it can take more heat and it can take more abuse. That being said, both our organic and metallic brake pads could not withstand the death mud that we encountered out there. So both of them definitely failed us. We did notice that the Shimano brake pads that we were using, they were metal brake pads, metal compound. They withstood a lot more grit and grime before failing than any of the SRAM brake pads. So that's kind of something of note that I was kind of surprised about. So overall, I had to change front and rear brake pads. Some of the other guys on the trip, they had basically brake pad, the backing, rub up against rotors. Luckily, we didn't find any significant rotor damage out there, but it could have been worse if we didn't actually pay attention to our brakes. The main takeaway, bring extra brake pads and check your brakes often. All right, so next up is the drivetrain, and man, this drivetrain saw so much wear and tear. This is a GX drivetrain from the shifter all the way down to the derailleur. I've got a race face carbon crank on here with a race face chainring. I'm actually very surprised by the way it shifted, especially through those crummy conditions. I had no issues. I was very cautious of shifting under load, especially when it was really sloppy. But in general, this drivetrain worked very well for me. It was basically impossible to avoid any of the slop on the trail. And oftentimes when we went through mud, we would try to find a creek or stream to ride through just so that we could clean it off, which is just kind of funny. So normally I get, 1,000, 2,000, maybe even more miles out of a chain. It really depends on the conditions, what I'm riding through. But this chain right here only has 400 miles on it. And with my chain checker, I checked the chain and it is 0.5% worn. And on an 11 or 12 speed chain, 0.5% worn means you need to replace the chain. This chain is toasted, and luckily it's not beyond 0.5% worn, because if it is, then I probably would have to consider replacing my cassette and or chainring. But my chainring probably also needs to be replaced as well, just taking a look at it. And then just taking a look at the pulley wheels as well. Those are actually in pretty good shape, surprisingly, even though the pulley wheels are the closest thing to the ground. Next up is bearings. And bearings are essential. They make your bike go. Between your headset, your bottom bracket, your pedals, your wheels, they are a very important component. Most of these modern bikes use sealed cartridge bearings now, which actually are really great. They're replaceable, but you shouldn't have to replace them very often, and they should withstand a lot of grit, grime, and water. That being said, oftentimes seals don't work properly, and there are ways of getting water, grit, and grime within that sealed cartridge bearing. So these sealed cartridge bearings, more times than not, you're going to be able to get a pretty good indication if it's worn out without removing it. That being said, removing it is beneficial. You'll be able to get a better feel. Things that you are looking for when you have a worn out bearing is just a grindy feel. You'll be able to actually feel all of the ball bearings within the bearing, and oftentimes it just isn't going to glide. If you want to learn how to feel your bike and make sure your bearings are in working order, make sure to click the link right up here. I did a video on a pre-bike packing list checkover. Looking over at all the bearings, the only bearings that actually ended up failing me were the rear hub bearings on my bike, and they didn't fail me. They're still working. They just need to be replaced. And that's kind of a shock. So that just kind of goes to show you all of the seals that actually cover the bearings on the bottom bracket and the headset work well. And the bearings in the hub, they are a little bit of a smaller bearing, so those tend to fail a little bit quicker. But this rear wheel was dunked in so much grit grime, it saw a ton of mud, so I'm not surprised there. Talking about the fork, this is a Marzocchi Bomber Z2, and this was the problem child of my bike. All right, so how do I explain this? The amount of mud, grit, and grime that this fork saw, a moving part on a bike, really messed it up. But in all seriousness, the fork has a really sticky feel. You know that really nice plush feel that you get on a new fork? Well, that is long, long gone here. The other problem I have with this fork is a knocking feeling. And I actually ended up thinking it was my headset. So one morning at camp, I completely undid and took out the fork and looked at my headset bearings, made sure everything was tight. It wasn't that. It definitely was my fork. And I started thinking about what it could be inside my fork. I did a little bit of research, and I think what happened was that my bushings ended up wearing out in my fork. So what I believe happened here, and I don't 100% know yet because, well, I haven't taken the fork apart, the mud ended up drying up. The lubrication absorbed that mud, which ended up drying up the lubrication. Thus, I don't have the proper parts of the fork lubricated, and so I'm wearing them down prematurely. So for oil and seals, I'd probably say I'm gonna do this myself, but I'm probably gonna bring this into my bike shop because I think it needs a little bit more work, unfortunately. Finally, talking about my dropper posts, which, believe it or not, worked extremely well considering how much mud was caked on it. This is a Trans-X adjustable dropper post. This is the dropper post that comes with the Salsa Timberjack GX build. This dropper post is actually the exact same as the P&W Rainier Generation 3. Just for reference. So dropper posts were the biggest issue on this trip. 2 out of the 5 dropper posts ended up failing, which is impressive to say the least. For me, the dropper was flawless because it didn't stick. It didn't have any sticking like some of the other droppers that I've used in the past. And the lever itself worked flawlessly, so no issues at all. So what I'm gonna do, even though this dropper is working pretty well, every single time I drop it, there is a dirt remnant that comes out. So there is probably a little bit of dirt in there. So I'm gonna take it apart, re-lubricate it, put it back together and see how it works. So with that all said, even though this trip is in the past, with these repairs and new parts for this bike, this trip got even more expensive just riding through these conditions. I already replaced my front and rear brake pads. The rear hub only has 700 miles on it. I already have to replace the bearings in that. I have to throw on a new chain. I'm probably gonna have to throw on a new chainring as well. I have to bring in my fork for at least a basic service, but in reality, it's probably going to need more. And I'm going to have to spend some time on cleaning out my dropper post. And finally, cleaning off the whole bike itself. So it's that point in the program when those rigid single speeders are, well, just laughing at me. Those 2 components on top of an internal geared box or hub and potentially nicer bearings, a fork, and just in general nicer components might just take these bike needs and repairs out of the equation. So overall, after 300 miles, did I destroy parts of my bike? Absolutely. But I'm also extremely surprised by other components on my bike that lasted, especially the bearings. So we go back to the question at hand, is it worth riding in conditions like that? To me, absolutely, because it creates character and an experience that is unmatched, especially when you're riding with friends on a route and a trip that you probably won't ever do again. But if I was to do it again or someone asked me to do it again, absolutely I would. If you have any comments or questions regarding this bike and the setup, leave it in the comment section below. And I also want to hear any of your horror stories on what might have happened on your recent bike packing trips to your bike. If you like what you saw in this video, make sure to hit that subscribe button and notification bell. And if you want to help support us a little bit more than that, please consider joining the Bikepacking Collective, which is BIKEPACKING.com's annual membership. There's a link below with more information, but in general, that will help support these videos and everything that you see on BIKEPACKING.com. As always, thank you all so much for watching and supporting our videos. Until next time, pedal further.